Marcus Thompson stood at his church podium every Sunday, his warm smile touching every corner of Miami's Hope and Glory Baptist Church. At 45 years old, he had everything a man could dream of: a beautiful wife, three healthy children, and a congregation that hung on his every word. Sarah Thompson, his wife of 15 years, always sat in the front row during his sermons. Her perfectly styled honey blonde hair and modest floral dresses made her the ideal preacher's wife. Their children, Michael, 14, Hannah, 12, and little David, 8, sat beside her, well behaved and dressed in their Sunday best. "And remember, my dear brothers and sisters," Marcus would say, his voice rich with conviction, "family is God's greatest gift to us." The congregation would nod in agreement, many stealing glances at the Thompson family, seeing them as the perfect example of Christian values. Behind the scenes, Marcus and Sarah's home life seemed just as picture perfect. Their two-story house in Miami Gardens, with its white picket fence and well-maintained garden, was often the site of church gatherings and youth group meetings. Sarah would prepare elaborate meals while Marcus told stories that made everyone laugh, their children helping to serve guests with bright smiles. Marcus's father, Reverend James Thompson, was a frequent visitor to their home. The elderly preacher had built Hope and Glory Baptist Church from the ground up 30 years ago, and now, at 70, he took great pride in seeing his son continue his legacy. He especially doted on his grandchildren, bringing them gifts and taking them on special outings. "You've done well, son," Reverend James would often say, patting Marcus on the back. "Sarah is a blessing, and those children are a testament to God's grace." Marcus would beam with pride, never noticing the lingering looks his father gave Sarah, or the way she would tense up whenever the elderly preacher was around. Life had a comfortable routine for the Thompsons. Marcus would start his days with prayer and Bible study in his home office. Sarah would get the children ready for school, pack their lunches, and kiss them goodbye. After dropping them off, she would help at the church, organizing charity events and leading the women's ministry. The congregation loved how Marcus and Sarah worked as a team. They counseled young couples together, with Marcus often using their own marriage as an example of God's perfect plan. "When I first met Sarah," he would tell them, "I knew she was the one God had chosen for me. She was just 19, working as my father's secretary at the church, but her faith and dedication to the Lord shone through." Their children were active in the church too. Michael played guitar in the youth worship band, Hannah helped with Sunday school, and little David was already showing signs of following in his father's footsteps, often pretending to preach to his stuffed animals. Every Thursday evening, the Thompson family would have dinner with Reverend James. These dinners were a tradition that had started when Marcus and Sarah first got married. "Family must stay close," the elderly preacher would insist, though Sarah often seemed to develop headaches on these evenings. The community looked up to the Thompsons. Other parents wanted their children to be like the Thompson kids, respectful, successful in school, and devoted to their faith. Young wives would seek Sarah's advice on marriage and motherhood, while aspiring preachers would ask Marcus for mentoring. "How do you do it all?" people would ask Sarah at church gatherings. She would smile her perfect smile and say, "With God's grace and a supportive family, anything is possible." But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her smile would fade and a shadow would cross her face. Marcus never noticed these moments. He was too busy basking in the glory of his perfect life. His sermons grew more confident each week, his leadership in the community stronger. He truly believed he was living proof of God's blessings, completely unaware that beneath the surface of his perfect family, dark secrets were waiting to emerge. As spring turned to summer in Miami, the Thompson family continued their picture-perfect existence. But like the hurricanes that sometimes threatened their coastal city, a storm was brewing, one that would tear through their lives with devastating force, leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. No one, least of all Marcus, could have predicted that a simple medical test would be the key to unlocking a truth so devastating it would destroy everything he believed in, everything he had built, and everyone he thought he could trust. The day that changed everything started like any other at Miami Children's Hospital. David Thompson, the youngest of the three children, sat nervously in the pediatrician's office, his small legs dangling from the examination table. Marcus and Sarah sat nearby, their hands clasped together as Dr. Rodriguez reviewed David's chart. "David's been having these headaches frequently," Dr. Rodriguez said, adjusting her glasses. Given your family history of migraines, Reverend Thompson, I think it would be wise to do some genetic screening, just to be on the safe side. She smiled reassuringly at the worried parents. Marcus nodded immediately. Whatever's best for our boy, he said, squeezing Sarah's hand. But he felt her stiffen beside him, her fingers turning cold in his grip. When he looked at his wife, he noticed her face had gone pale. Is everything okay, honey? Marcus asked, concerned by her reaction. Sarah forced a smile. Just worried about the needles. You know how I get about medical procedures. But her voice trembled slightly, and she wouldn't meet Dr. Rodriguez's eyes. The doctor explained that they should test all three children, since genetic conditions often affected siblings. It's a simple blood test, she assured them. We can screen for various hereditary conditions that might explain David's headaches. Later that afternoon, Marcus called Michael and Hannah to join them at the hospital. The teenagers arrived, puzzled by the urgent summons. Hannah, ever the dramatic one, worried it was something serious with their little brother. It's just a precaution, Marcus explained, watching as the nurse prepared the testing kits. Better safe than sorry. Sarah stood in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She kept checking her phone, her fingers tapping nervously against its screen. When the nurse asked for her family medical history, she stammered through the responses. Mrs. Thompson, the nurse said gently, will need accurate information for the tests to be meaningful. Are you sure there's no history of genetic disorders in your family? I'm not sure, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents died when I was young, you know that, Marcus. She looked at her husband, who nodded sympathetically, remembering how Sarah had been orphaned as a teenager and taken in by the church community. The blood draw process was quick. Michael went first, trying to act brave for his younger siblings. Hannah followed, wincing but managing not to cry. Little David needed some convincing, but eventually allowed the nurse to take his sample after Marcus promised him ice cream. The results should be ready in about 2 weeks, Dr. Rodriguez explained as she finished the paperwork. We'll call you to schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss them. On the drive home, Sarah was unusually quiet. Marcus attributed it to her worry about David's health, but something about her behavior seemed off. She kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. That evening, Sarah barely touched her dinner. She spent an unusually long time in the shower, and when she came to bed, her eyes were red and puffy. Sweetheart, Marcus said, pulling her close, David will be fine. God is watching over our children. Sarah burst into tears, burying her face in his chest. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. Marcus held her, assuming she was just overwhelmed by concern for their son. There's nothing to be sorry for, he assured her. Whatever the tests show, we'll handle it together. That's what family does. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. Sarah grew more withdrawn each day, making excuses to skip Thursday dinner with Reverend James and spending long hours alone in their bedroom. She stopped attending church events, claiming migraines of her own. Marcus threw himself into his ministry work, trying to keep his mind off the pending test results. He never imagined that the simple genetic screening would reveal something far more devastating than any medical condition, a truth that would shatter his faith, destroy his family, and lead him down a path of darkness from which there would be no return. Little did he know, the next time Dr. Rodriguez's office called, it wouldn't just be about David's headaches. It would be about a secret that had been hidden for 15 years, a betrayal so deep it would turn a man of God into something unrecognizable. Dr. Rodriguez's office called on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was in his church office preparing Sunday's sermon when his phone rang. The doctor's voice was unusually serious as she asked both Marcus and Sarah to come in immediately to discuss the test results. That afternoon, they sat in the doctor's office, the Miami sun streaming through the windows. Sarah hadn't spoken a word during the drive, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Dr. Rodriguez entered with 3 thick folders, her face grave. Reverend Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, she began, adjusting her glasses. The genetic screening revealed something unexpected. She paused, choosing her words carefully. According to these results, there's a biological inconsistency that we need to address. Marcus leaned forward. What kind of inconsistency? The DNA patterns indicate that you, Reverend Thompson, are not the biological father of any of the children. Dr. Rodriguez's words fell like heavy stones in the quiet room. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He turned to Sarah, who had collapsed into silent sobs, her face buried in her hands. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice hoarse. "Run the tests again." "We already did," Dr. Rodriguez replied softly. "3 times, to be absolutely certain." But there was more. Dr. Rodriguez continued, her voice gentle but professional. "There's another finding that's concerning. The children's biological father appears to be a close relative of yours, Reverend Thompson. The genetic markers suggest it's your father." The room began to spin. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. 15 years of marriage. 3 children. Every memory, every moment, suddenly tainted. He looked at Sarah, who couldn't meet his eyes. "How long?" he whispered. Sarah's response was barely audible. "Since before we were married." Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. The crash echoed through the small office. "My father? My own father." His voice rose with each word, years of trust crumbling around him. Dr. Rodriguez quietly excused herself, leaving the couple alone with their unraveling world. Through the office window, Marcus could see people walking in the parking lot, going about their normal lives, unaware that his entire existence had just been shattered. "It started when I was 19, Sarah spoke into the silence, her voice shaking. "When I first started working at the church, your father, he said he would help me after my parents died. But then—" Marcus raised his hand, stopping her words. The pieces were falling into place, the strange tensions at family dinners, Sarah's headaches during their weekly visits with his father, the way she always seemed to shrink when Reverend James was around. "All these years," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Every Sunday, watching me preach about family and faith. Watching me teach our children, his children, about honesty and morality. Was it amusing for you both?" Sarah reached for him, but he stepped back. "Marcus, please. I wanted to tell you so many times. I was scared. Your father, he said he would destroy everything if I ever." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, he was replaying every moment, every memory. His father blessing their marriage, his father holding each newborn child, his father leading family prayers at their dinner table. Each memory now poisoned, twisted into something ugly and corrupt. He walked out of the office without another word, leaving Sarah calling after him. In his car, he sat motionless, staring at the hospital building. His phone buzzed repeatedly, Sarah, probably, trying to explain the unexplainable. Then another message came through, from his father. "Son," Sarah called, "we need to talk." Marcus felt something break inside him. The loving son, the devoted husband, the respected preacher, all of these identities crumbled away, leaving something dark and dangerous in their place. He started his car, his mind already filling with thoughts he never imagined he could have. As he drove away from the hospital, the Miami heat seemed to intensify, matching the burning rage growing inside him. His father's message continued to flash on his phone, each word fueling a transformation from a man of God to someone capable of unspeakable acts. The truth had been revealed, but this was only the beginning. The real horror was yet to come. Marcus drove aimlessly through Miami's streets for hours, his mind racing. When he finally returned home, the house was empty. A note from Sarah said she had taken the children to her sister's place, giving him space to process everything. In the silence of his home, Marcus went to his study and pulled out old photo albums. Each image now held a different meaning. His father standing too close to Sarah in family photos. The way Sarah's smile never quite reached her eyes at church events. The special gifts his father always brought for the children. His hands trembling, Marcus opened his laptop and logged into Sarah's email account. They had shared passwords throughout their marriage, a sign of trust that now felt like a cruel joke. He searched through years of correspondence, and there it was, a hidden folder labeled Church Records. Inside, he found hundreds of emails between Sarah and his father, dating back to when she first started working at the church. The earliest ones were innocent enough, a young orphan girl grateful for a father figure's guidance. But then the tone changed. "My dearest Sarah," one email from his father read, dated just months before her marriage to Marcus. "We must be more careful now. Marcus can never know. Remember, you owe me everything. Your job, your place in the church, your future. My son will give you the respectability you need." Marcus's hands shook as he read email after email. The truth emerged like a horror story, each detail more devastating than the last. His father had manipulated a vulnerable teenage girl, using her dependency on the church and her fear of being alone to control her. Standing suddenly, Marcus walked to his father's old office in the church next door. Using his master key, he entered the dark room that still held decades of church records. In a locked filing cabinet, hidden behind tax documents, he found a stack of old letters in Sarah's handwriting. "Please, let me tell him," one letter begged. "I can't bear lying to him anymore. The children deserve to know their real father." The letter was dated just 3 years ago. His father's response was clipped to it. "Remember what's at stake." Marcus would never understand. Think of the scandal, the shame. The children would lose everything. This is God's test of our discretion. As Marcus dug deeper, he discovered bank statements showing regular payments to Sarah's personal account from his father's private funds. Vacation photos of his father with Sarah and the children during times when Marcus had been away at religious conferences. Birthday cards signed, "With all my love, Dad," hidden in Sarah's desk drawer. The deception was complete, meticulously planned, and had been maintained for over 15 years. His entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. Marcus's phone buzzed again, another message from his father. "Son, please come see me. There are things you don't understand." In that moment, something snapped inside Marcus. He remembered all the sermons he had preached about forgiveness, about God's love, about family values. Every word had been made hollow by the very man who taught him to preach. He found himself opening his father's computer, still logged in with the password he'd always known. There, in a hidden folder, were more photos. Sarah, as a teenage girl, looking young and vulnerable, standing beside his father at church events. The timestamps showed a progression of their relationship, even before she had met Marcus. The final piece fell into place when he found a letter his father had drafted but never sent, dated just before Marcus and Sarah's wedding. "My darling Sarah, watching you marry my son tomorrow will be the hardest thing I've ever done. But remember our agreement. This is the only way we can all have what we want. You'll have respectability, I'll have you, and Marcus will have the family he desires. God forgive us all." Marcus sat in his father's chair, surrounded by 15 years of lies and betrayal. The man who had taught him about morality, who had guided his path to ministry, who had smiled and blessed his marriage. That man had stolen everything from him. As night fell over Miami, Marcus began to formulate a plan. The rage inside him had crystallized into something cold and purposeful. The preacher who had taught forgiveness was gone, replaced by a man who could only think of vengeance. For the next 2 weeks, Marcus maintained a perfect facade. He continued his duties at Hope and Glory Baptist Church, his sermons growing increasingly focused on betrayal and divine punishment. The congregation noticed a change in their beloved preacher. His voice carried a new intensity, his eyes burned with an unsettling fire. Today's sermon, he announced one Sunday morning, his gaze fixed on his father in the front row, is about Judas Iscariot, about those who betray their own blood. His father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Sarah, sitting several rows back, clutched her purse with trembling hands. At home, Marcus spent hours in his study, writing in his journal. The pages filled with dark thoughts and detailed plans. He recorded every lie, every betrayal, building a timeline of deception. His handwriting grew more erratic with each entry, the pages sometimes stained with tears or marked by the force of his pen breaking through the paper. Sarah had returned home with the children, attempting to maintain normalcy, but the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Marcus barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words carried double meanings that made her flinch. The children missed their grandfather, Sarah said one evening, her voice small. "They're asking why we haven't had Thursday dinner with him lately." Marcus looked up from his Bible, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Oh, they'll see him soon enough. We all will." During counseling sessions with church members, Marcus's advice took a darker turn. When a young wife confessed to considering an affair, he lectured her for an hour about eternal damnation. When a teenager admitted to lying to his parents, Marcus's response was so severe that the boy left in tears. His father tried to reach him several times. "Son, we need to talk about this as men of God," one voicemail said. What happened was wrong. We can find forgiveness. Marcus saved every message, every text. He recorded every call. Each communication became another piece of evidence in his growing archive of betrayal. One night, he found himself standing in his children's rooms, watching them sleep. Michael, with his grandfather's nose. Hannah, with his father's eyes. Little David, who had his father's smile, not Marcus's, but Reverend James's. The realization made him physically sick. During Sunday services, Marcus's sermons became increasingly apocalyptic. He preached about God's wrath, about punishment for the wicked, about sins of the flesh. The congregation was spellbound, mistaking his growing madness for religious fervor. The Lord knows what is hidden in darkness, he thundered from the pulpit, his voice reaching a fever pitch, and he will bring all secrets into the light. After one particularly intense sermon, a church elder approached him with concern. Reverend Thompson, is everything all right? You seem different lately. Marcus smiled his practiced smile. Just feeling especially close to God's justice these days, Brother Williams. Sometimes his plan requires a firm hand. At home, he began making preparations. He moved money between accounts, updated his will, and gathered important documents. He told Sarah he was planning a special surprise for their anniversary. She knew better but remained silent, fear keeping her from questioning him. One evening, he called his children into his study. He hugged each of them tightly, breathing in their scent, memorizing their faces. No matter what happens, he told them, remember that I loved you as my own. Always. The children, confused by his intensity, hugged him back. That night, he arranged for them to stay with Sarah's sister for a few days, claiming he was planning a surprise party for their mother. In his study, Marcus opened his Bible to the book of Judges, reading about Samson's revenge. His hand trembled as he dialed his father's number. Dad, he said, his voice eerily calm. I think it's time we had that talk. Come over tomorrow night. Sarah will be here too. As he hung up, Marcus looked at his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him wasn't the respected preacher anymore. In his eyes was something else, something that had been growing since that day in the doctor's office, something dark and irreversible. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the death of Marcus Thompson, the man of God, and the birth of something else entirely. The evening arrived humid and heavy, typical for Miami in summer. Marcus sat in his darkened study, watching the driveway through the window. His father's car pulled up first, right on time as always. 10 minutes later, Sarah's Honda parked behind it. Marcus had prepared the house meticulously. Worship music played softly in the background, old hymns about judgment and retribution. The dining room table was set for 3, with the good china they used for special occasions. Son, his father's voice echoed through the hallway. Sarah and I are here. Marcus emerged from his study, wearing his Sunday best. In the dining room, he called out, his voice steady. I thought we should have our Thursday family dinner, for old time's sake. Sarah and Reverend James exchanged nervous glances as they entered the dining room. The table was set with a feast, all of Sarah's favorite dishes that she used to make for their family dinners. Sit, Marcus commanded softly. Let's pray before we eat, like we always did. They bowed their heads, but Marcus's prayer was unlike any they'd heard before. Dear Lord, he began, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage, we gather here tonight to confess our sins, to speak truth in your presence, to face judgment. When he finished, he remained standing, looking down at them. 15 years, he said. 15 years of lies. Every prayer, every meal, every Sunday service, all of it built on deceit. Marcus, please, his father started, we never meant to. Never meant to what, Dad? Marcus's voice rose. Never meant to destroy my life. Never meant for me to find out. Tell me, when you held my children, your children, at their baptisms, did you think about how you were mocking God? Sarah began to sob quietly. The children, she whispered. Please think about the children. The children? Marcus laughed, a hollow sound. My children who aren't mine. The ones you both lied about for 15 years. Those children. He walked to the kitchen and returned with a bottle of wine, his father's favorite. Let's have a drink, he said, pouring 3 glasses, to family. His father pushed the glass away. Son, you're not thinking clearly. Let's talk about this rationally, as men of God. Men of God? Marcus's hand tightened around his own glass. Was it godly to seduce a teenage girl? To make her marry your son while you continue to? He couldn't finish the sentence. The room grew darker as clouds covered the moon outside. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a summer storm approaching. I loved her, Reverend James said quietly. I still love her. Something snapped inside Marcus. The glass in his hand shattered, blood mixing with wine. Sarah screamed as Marcus lunged across the table, his hands finding his father's throat. Marcus, stop. Sarah tried to pull him away, but he pushed her aside. She fell, hitting her head against the china cabinet. What happened next was a blur of violence and rage. Years of betrayal, lies, and suppressed anger exploded in one terrible moment. When Marcus finally stepped back, his father lay unconscious on the dining room floor. Sarah was crying in the corner, blood trickling from her temple. Please, she begged. It's not too late to stop this. But Marcus wasn't Marcus anymore. The respected preacher, the forgiving Christian, the gentle father, that man was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone capable of unthinkable acts. He walked to his study and returned with rope and duct tape. This ends tonight, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. All of it. Outside, the storm broke over Miami. Lightning illuminated the dining room in stark flashes, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Thunder masked the sounds from within the house. Hours later, as rain pounded against the windows, Marcus stood alone in his blood-spattered dining room. The perfect table setting was destroyed, the family dinner turned into a scene of horror. He looked at his hands, the hands that had blessed countless congregants, baptized babies, and held his children. They were now stained with something that could never be washed away. The night was far from over. There was still work to be done, evidence to be disposed of, a plan to be executed. But in that moment, standing in his ruined dining room, Marcus Thompson finally felt at peace. The first body part was discovered by a jogger in Virginia Key Beach Park, just as the sun was rising over Miami. Within hours, police found more remains scattered across different locations, in Biscayne Bay, near the Coral Gables waterfront, and behind an abandoned warehouse in Little Haiti. Detective Maria Ramirez stood at the first crime scene, watching as forensics teams worked methodically. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates from other locations. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of what had happened to Sarah Thompson. The precision of the cuts, the medical examiner told her, suggests someone with knowledge of anatomy, or someone who took their time. He pointed to the clean edges of the dismemberment. This wasn't done in a frenzy. Meanwhile, at Miami International Airport, security cameras caught Marcus Thompson attempting to board a flight to Nassau. His clothes were newly purchased, his passport recently issued. But there was something about his calm demeanor that alarmed the gate agent, who had seen the morning news about a missing woman. Sir, could you step aside for additional screening? The agent asked. Marcus smiled his preacher's smile, but his eyes were empty. When airport police approached, he didn't resist. In his carry-on bag, they found a first-class ticket to the Bahamas and $50,000 in cash. Back at the Thompson house, police discovered a meticulously clean dining room, but luminol revealed massive bloodstains on the floor, walls, and furniture. In Marcus's study, they found his journal, detailing every step of his plan. He wrote about it like a sermon, Detective Ramirez told her partner, complete with biblical references and theological justifications. The media descended on Hope and Glory Baptist Church. Reporters interviewed shocked congregation members who couldn't reconcile the beloved preacher they knew with the monster in the headlines. He baptized my children, one church elder sobbed on camera. How could he do this? At the police station, Marcus sat calmly in the interrogation room. He answered every question with unnerving precision, describing each cut, each disposal site, as if he were giving directions to the grocery store. She betrayed not just me, he explained to Detective Ramirez, but God himself. The punishment had to fit the sin. When asked about his father's whereabouts, Marcus simply smiled. Reverend James Thompson had vanished the same night as Sarah. His car was found abandoned at the marina, but extensive searches of the waters yielded nothing. The Thompson children, still at their aunt's house, were sheltered from the initial news. But in the age of social media, they couldn't be protected for long. Michael, the oldest, found out through a text from a school friend. Hannah saw it on Instagram. Little David overheard his aunt crying on the phone. The district attorney called it the most shocking case in Miami's recent history. A respected religious leader, a family man, transforming into a calculated killer overnight, she told the press. It shakes our faith in human nature. But it wasn't overnight, as Marcus's journal revealed. The rage had built slowly, methodically, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Each Sunday sermon had become darker, each Bible study more focused on vengeance and divine punishment. Forensics teams continued to find evidence. A rental storage unit contained power tools and cleaning supplies. Marcus's GPS history led them to more disposal sites. Security cameras from various locations showed him making multiple trips in the early morning hours, always calm, always methodical. The church community rallied around the children, setting up a trust fund for their future. But the psychological damage was done. They had lost their mother to murder, their father to madness, and their grandfather to disappearance, all in one terrible night. Detective Ramirez finally closed her initial report at 3 a.m., a week after the first discovery. On her desk sat crime scene photos, witness statements, and Marcus's journal. The last entry, written just hours before the murders, read, "Tonight, God's justice will be served. The wages of sin is death, and payment is due." As she drove home through Miami's empty streets, past the church where Marcus had preached for 15 years, she couldn't shake the image of him in the interrogation room, perfectly composed, at peace with his actions, convinced that he had carried out divine will. The city would never be the same, and somewhere in the depths of Biscayne Bay, more secrets waited to be discovered. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse was packed on the first day of Marcus Thompson's trial. 3 months had passed since the murders, and the case had captured national attention. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat perfectly straight, still wearing his clerical collar, his face showing no emotion. District Attorney Elena Martinez presented her opening statement to the stunned courtroom. "This is not just about murder," she declared. "This is about a man who used his position of religious authority to hide the monster within, who planned and executed a brutal revenge with the same precision he once used to plan his sermons." The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's journal provided a detailed roadmap of his descent into violence. Security footage showed him disposing of remains across Miami. The DNA evidence, ironically, the same science that had revealed his father's betrayal, now proved his guilt beyond doubt. But it was the testimony of his children that silenced the courtroom. Michael, now 15, took the stand first. "The last time I saw Mom," he testified, his voice shaking, "she hugged me extra tight, like she knew something was wrong. Dad." He just stood there watching us, smiling in a way that scared me. Hannah's testimony was read by a court official. The 14-year-old had attempted suicide 2 weeks before the trial and was still in psychiatric care. Her written statement described how she had found her father's journal after his arrest, how she had read his detailed plans for murder, and how she would never forget his final words to them, "Remember that I loved you as my own." Little David, too young to testify, spent his days in therapy, drawing pictures of broken homes and dark figures. His aunt, now his legal guardian, told reporters that he still woke up screaming most nights. Halfway through the trial, another shocking discovery was made. Workers dredging Biscayne Bay found a weighted drum containing the remains of Reverend James Thompson. The prosecution added another murder charge to Marcus's case. Marcus finally spoke at his sentencing hearing. He stood before the judge, still wearing his preacher's collar, and delivered what sounded like his final sermon. "I served God's justice," he declared, his voice steady. "When David slew Goliath, was it murder? When Samson brought down the temple, was it a crime? The law of man may condemn me, but divine law understands that some sins require the ultimate punishment." Judge Maria Hernandez was unmoved. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "you speak of divine justice, but what I see is a man who used religion to justify his darkest impulses. You didn't serve God's justice, you served your own vengeful rage." The sentence was announced: life imprisonment without possibility of parole for each murder, to be served consecutively. As he was led away, Marcus turned to look at his children one last time, but they had already left the courtroom. Hope and Glory Baptist Church struggled to recover from the scandal. Attendance dropped sharply, and many longtime members left, Unable to reconcile their faith with the horrors committed by their former preacher, the new pastor worked to rebuild trust, but the shadow of Marcus Thompson's crimes lingered. The children moved to another state with their aunt, changing their last name to escape the notoriety. Michael eventually became an advocate for victims of religious abuse. Hannah, after years of therapy, wrote a memoir about surviving family trauma. David, the youngest, chose a path furthest from his father's, becoming a scientist, seeking truth in data and evidence rather than faith. 5 years after the trial, Detective Ramirez visited Marcus in prison for a follow-up investigation. She found him in the prison chapel, leading a Bible study group. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes still held that unsettling certainty. "Do you regret what you did?" she asked him. Marcus looked up from his Bible, a familiar preacher's smile crossing his face. "Regret is for those who act without purpose," he replied. "Everything I did was part of God's plan." As she left the prison, Ramirez thought about the Thompson children, about Sarah and Reverend James, about the congregation that had trusted Marcus for so many years. His actions had created ripples of trauma that would affect generations to come. The case became required study at the FBI Academy, a cautionary tale about the thin line between faith and fanaticism, love and obsession, justice and revenge. But for those who lived through it, the true legacy was in the shattered lives left behind, and the realization that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who claim to speak for God.